Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Winoka Yepa. I am Dene, originally from Chibok, New Mexico, and I am the Program Manager of Research and Education at Native Americans in Philanthropy. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for Native American in Philanthropy's member education sessions for today's discussion about Indigenous data sovereignty and beyond. If this is your first time joining us, the goal of these sessions is to share topics and issues that affect our communities from the perspective of those specializing in these areas and provide an opportunity for the philanthropic sector to learn and to act. As many of us are aware, data drives investment decision-making, and the philanthropic sector is no stranger to these practices. For Indigenous communities, however, data is a complicated and nuanced topic, from mismanagement to data used as a weapon. There are countless reasons why leaders in the sector are advocating for Indigenous data sovereignty through ethical data practices, cyber sovereignty, and more. I'm excited to introduce today's discussion and the powerful leaders we have joining us who fight daily to ensure data practices and digital security are not only equitable, but are treated as the sovereign rights and responsibilities that they are to our communities and nations. We hope you enjoy today's topic and learn more about how we can work together to ensure Indigenous people are being respected and included in decision-making for the stewardship of data. It is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, President and CEO of Poston and Associates, and dear friend to us here at NAP, Steph Poston. Welcome back, Steph.
Thank you so much, Winoka. It's super exciting panel today. As Winoka said, my name is Steph Poston. I'm coming to you from the Pueblo of Sandia, Territory here in New Mexico. Super excited about our guest. Each of the guests is a trailblazer in their own right. They are engaged in community. They are connected to community and just brilliant in their ideas and their forward thinking and their love for community. So super excited to have you here on this session. The first one up I'd like to have introduced is a good friend, Kimball Sekaquaptewa. Kimball?
Good morning, everybody. Greetings from Cochiti, Pueblo. My name is Kimball. I'm the Chief Technology Director at the Santa Fe Indian School. We are a off-reservation boarding school in Santa Fe, New Mexico, serving 700 students from the 19 Pueblos, the Navajo and Apache tribes. We also serve our communities through outreach for building and improving broadband infrastructure. So I have some dual roles in that capacity as the project director for what we call the Pueblo Education Network. We're currently in a fourth build and will be totaling about 600 miles of middle mile fiber optic connectivity that goes out to all those service communities that I mentioned in our rural and remote New Mexico tribes. Lastly, I serve as the chair of the Connect New Mexico Council, which is the advisory group to our New Mexico Office of Broadband Access and Deployment, which is, as many of you know, part of once in a generation, we're calling it opportunity nationally for infrastructure funding for broadband deployment and digital equity. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimball. I'd also like to call up, next is Marina Shahey.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Marina Shihei. I'm Tewa and Jewish. My family comes from the Pueblo of San Ildefonso, and I'm married into the Pueblo of Zia. I am the founding general partner of Endemic Venture Capital. I'm focused on building Indigenous-led climate products and products to support the tribal gaming industries that are the foundations to our tribal economies. I began my career as an investment analyst at UBS, and I've spent 2 decades in high-tech startups with a specialization in Web3, cybersecurity, and digital assets. This is currently my second venture fund. I hold an MBA in finance from the Wharton School. And I also run a consultancy called Zia Impact, working in impact strategy and tribal infrastructure development. I've done some broadband work, and this is how I know Kimball and Steph. And I'm really looking forward to being here with you all today. So thank you.
Thanks, Marina. Our other panelist today is Carly Badhartwell. So welcome to your introduction.
Hamitakuyepi, Chante washte nape chiuzapie, washichu ia Carly Badhartwell, amakiapie, Dakota ia tokadakia maniwi, mieye, Damakota, Muscogee Creek hemacha nakon wakpa ipaksha hemataha, Minnesota makoche did watie. Hello, friends and relatives. I greet you all with a handshake and a good heart. My name is Carly Badhartwell. In Dakota, my name is Tokadakia Maniwi, which means woman who walks toward the future. I'm a citizen of the Flandreau Santee Dakota Nation. I'm also Muscogee Creek, and I'm joining from my ancestral homelands of Minnesota Makoche, also known as Minnesota, where I live with an amazing 6-year-old son, Quill, who may or may not show up today. Hopefully not. We'll see what happens. I'm the executive director of Native Ways Federation. So our mission is to activate and expand informed giving to Native nonprofits through donor education and advocacy. And our organization was founded by a number of national Native nonprofits, including Association on American Indian Affairs, Native American Rights Fund, American Indian Science and Engineering Society, National ICWA, First Nations Development Institute, American Indian College Fund. So these folks started coming together. They started Native Ways Federation due in large part to a couple of issues. One, the lack of philanthropic giving coming into Indian country, and two, the fact that the majority of those dollars were not going to Native-led organizations. So our focus is on Native-led, and that's who we represent. I'm also super proud to serve as a board member of Native Americans in Philanthropy, and I'm just really happy to be here today. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Very powerful introduction. Amazing work. I've tracked, I think, every one of you and the work you're doing. So thank you for being a part of the panel. We'll jump right into question 1. And I'm going to direct this, if Marina can answer the first question, is data sovereignty is far-reaching and broad that many people become easily overwhelmed when learning about the topic. How would you demystify data sovereignty and encourage others to learn more and support this work?
So everywhere we interact with that has any type of written or digital imprint, leaves some kind of data, right? And there are, just a brilliant consortium of Indigenous scholars who have defined this very clearly over the years, that Indigenous data sovereignty also includes aspects of our cultural lifeways and cultural intellectual property. And just the idea that for an Indigenous nation to have sovereignty over data, we have the right to collect, have ownership, and determine in the applications of any data that affects the tribe, tribal members, tribally owned enterprises, and anything, again, that has to do with cultural intellectual property. I think this gets also really interesting as we move forward into cyberspace, and there's, just outrageous amounts of data on every movement that we make, every word that we say, out there, what the potential implications of that ultimately can be. I think we're still figuring out what that looks like, especially as we move into generative AI. And we are in a position to get ahead of it and take control of, the way that we approve of that data usage, whether it's visual data, whether it's cultural data, or whether it's, some form of technical data.
Thank you. Carly, same question. With data sovereignty being very broad and complex and overwhelming, how would you demystify data sovereignty and encourage us to learn more and support the work?
Thank you. So I previously worked as a grant manager, program officer at a foundation, and I get the issue. You know, I fell into data work accidentally, quite frankly. And once you jump in, it's like opening up Pandora's box. It's intimidating. There's so much that's going on. But it's also really important that that box is opened. And so I think the key thing to remember is that data tells a story. And it's super important that that story, that we understand that the story that's being told, or the stories that are being told, that they exist long after the systems do in many ways. And so, you know, when I say that, what I'm thinking about is, you know, who decides the information represented by the data, you know, who decides who holds the data, who shares it, all of that determines the narrative that is put forward and ultimately decides who benefits from that narrative. And so that story piece, I think, is so important for folks to be thinking about. I would encourage folks to dig into this topic. I know we have a number of foundations on the call. I'm hoping we do, because this is an equity issue. And you know, when we talk about data and how data is used, how it has the power to reinforce prejudice and inequitable behavior, it can and has played a role in perpetuating inequities. And we'll talk about that, I think, a bit more as the conversation moves forward. But there's this misconception that data is neutral. And we know that that's far from the truth. Data is not objective. How it's collective, who's collecting it, it matters. It can perpetuate power dynamics depending on how the data is being collected and by who. And so we need to be in these data spaces as Native people across the board as part of our greater visibility work. And so, you know, that's something that I just, you know, want to put forward for Native folks on the call too, is that this is part of us telling our story. And so it is important. And for folks in positions of power who are on the call, who are relying on data to make decisions about our communities or about, you know, how they're going or not going to engage with us, recognizing that that data is only as good as it's collected, analyzed, interpreted, and distributed. And so we're going to dig into that. But I think it's really important. So long story short, I guess, you know, for the foundation folks, encourage you to look at the data for you know, the perspective of the communities that you're serving, or if you're not serving, that's something to think about too. And also just, you need to understand that for the non-Native folks who are here, you have a responsibility, you know, with the data that you use. We all do. So I shouldn't just say non-Natives. For all of us, we have a responsibility. Data, if it's part of storytelling, if it's part of telling a narrative, when somebody entrusts you with their story, it's a gift. And so you have a responsibility to take care of it. So that's what I would want to share. Thank you.
Thanks, Carly. Like very important points there. Same question, Kimball. How would we demystify data sovereignty and encourage others to learn more?
Well, I think I would just add on, and I appreciate what Carly's saying about narrative, especially, or to pick up from there. You know, as Native communities, we've been consumers of information from the TV when that came into our communities and radically changed our lifestyles. And, you know, our perception of who we should be and what we should look like. And so I see the internet as a great opportunity, though not without its dangers. And I do hear that when I'm in tribal councils and there's cautions from, you know, the elders or or even, you know, the war captains, you know, about what we're bringing in. And I would say that what the bad part we already brought in on the cell phones that we pay too much for. But as we as communities begin to use the internet, put in the infrastructure, but become content creators, so we're no longer just consuming information from the internet, we're creating the content and we're providing our version of us for the world to clarify misrepresentations. But then we're also now using it in formal and informal ways for things like Native language maintenance. You know, and that could be the way people use it on Facebook. And is that always a good idea? Maybe yes, maybe no. I think that's part of the conversation we're going to have today. But I do believe that in this, the use of us at our age and the younger generations, and how we can't even imagine how they're going to use it, that this is a tool that we can use to create opportunities for ourselves and improve economic and social well-being for all of our communities, especially with that lens of cultural preservation.
Yeah, I really like the idea about the whole being our own narrators of our story and being our own content creators. I think that's a really important act toward the whole data sovereignty piece. So thank you all for the responses. Marina, this is directed at you. You have a long background in tech policy work, especially around sovereignty issues. Can you share with us an overview of what the legal and policy issues are surrounding digital and data sovereignty, and why it is important that philanthropy invest in this work?
So that's
big question.
That's a huge question. So basically, right now, the main thing that we need to help our tribal leadership understand about data sovereignty is that it's a pillar under cyber sovereignty, cyber governance, and what it actually means to be a sovereign nation in cyberspace. Right now, and to my knowledge, I might be incorrect. Somebody might have moved forward in this, since I've last reviewed, but we don't have that in Indian country right now, where we have said, we are sovereign nations in cyberspace specifically, and that, all of the data that's collected by any digital entity, any like satellite data that's coming out and being put forward on the internet of our villages, that we don't allow photos in, we don't allow any other types of data to be scraped. Right now, it's all out there in public. And, this work, in order to create tribal digital human rights protections that unfortunately the U.S. will not ever, I don't want to say ever, but, has no pathway to advance, because they prioritize corporate rights above, human rights. And right now, tribes really need to understand the challenges that exist and the protections that need to be enabled, but also the economic opportunities that are available in this space. So, it's controlling our data, controlling how we want to be perceived, controlling, what's scraped and where and why and how. These are really difficult conversations to have with, U.S. policymakers, let alone tribal governments who are not as exposed to the evolving works in tech policy. So there needs to be a lot more support for that. But in addition to it, the opportunities need to be presented for the fact that, look, 1 in 10 jobs in the United States right now is digital. 30% of the global GDP has to do with digital spaces. We make really good neighbors. We can create our own unique regulatory environments around our data. We just have to have the skill sets and support, and some of the knowledge bases that exist more in these outside spaces. And this is something where right now the world discusses that economies are global and flat because of this digital enablement. This is not coming into our tribal nations. Right now, we're still focused on primary connectivity, how our internet, especially if we operate our own WISPs or internet service providers in any capacity, like how we're going to pay for O&M, understanding what that investment really is on a community-wide level. We also need, a lot of skill sets and legal and policy work at this time, because this is an emerging policy space, like tribal digital rights, tribal data rights. There needs to be a lot of very heavy legal thought around what that looks like on a per tribal level, and then also, how we can help each other in collective working groups. I've talked about this with a lot of national Native organizations of how we can create those working groups, what that can look like. That interest in moving forward is there. We're not I think it's always really hard to find additional capacities from other things that we're working on, right? And as we are always in recovery from human capital loss of colonization, there's just not enough people to focus on these issues. So we do need a lot of outside support coming in and working with us to say what's possible and allow tribes to determine what that looks like individually and within our nations. I know our Pueblos are going to have a very different perspective on this than from where Carly's from. And we've talked about this a little bit, and we do have data sovereignty resolutions here, but we don't have cyber rights. We have American rights in cyberspace. Our tribes have American rights in cyberspace, tribal members, tribal businesses, and we don't always know what that can look like. But we need to see examples and just have support with that opportunity.
Thanks, Marina. You are a wealth of information in that space. It really is complicated, and I appreciate that you continue to kind of wrap your arms around it and share that information, and very generous with that information. Thank you so much. The next question is directed for Carly. What is data sovereignty to you specifically, and what are some examples of how data sovereignty has been supported in the philanthropic sector? You might want to unmute your. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry for that. Thank you, Steph and Marina. I just want to thank you for what you brought to the table. I'm not a tech person. I'm a systems navigator. I'm a philanthropy person. I previously worked at the Bush Foundation. I was a grant manager, program officer. And part of what I'm sharing today is around how do we take this information and how do we, we have all these conversations around, all these conversations are happening around equity. And how does data fit into that? Because, I think what we're going to share today is that it fits into that in a lot of ways. And I think some folks don't realize that. And so, we often rely on, and when I say we, I think for those who have worked in foundation, government, maybe some, non-native kind of institutional settings, we rely on technology to capture data, and we forget that we're dealing with people. And when we step back and take a moment and think about, to the point I think that I tried to make earlier, which is, data tells a story, and what story are we trying to tell, and who benefits from this story? It's really, really important to remember that people aspect. And so understanding who the folks are that are working in this space, and some of them are on this call today. And so encouraging folks to connect with them, and helping philanthropy to understand, foundations to understand that the fact is philanthropy overwhelmingly supports research that leaves us out. And in part, that's because our numbers, whether it's our numbers or our rural locations, whatever it is, we're often considered statistically insignificant. And we're relegated to these kind of other categories. I've been to so many conferences, whether it was philanthropy and education or philanthropy and some other topic, and they put up the bar charts and everything, and we're nowhere to be seen, except we think we're probably in that other category. That's a problem. So that and that results in us being left out, quite frankly, in potential funding opportunities. One of the pieces that I wanted to share today was some work that I did before I was at Native Ways Federation at the Bush Foundation. So I was working as a grant manager, and we were looking at how are we doing across Indian country? We really want to know across all of our program areas. And at first, the thought was, let's pull a report. And it won't be, let's pull a report and that'll be it. That, again, opened up Pandora's box, which is what I spoke to earlier, which was, we pulled this report and there was so much inconsistency, with how data had been recorded over time, what did it mean to be Native serving, Native led? And we didn't really get a good sense, I think, of how we were doing it in Indian country, which was the hope. We see these data points out there, which, like 0.4% of large philanthropic giving is going to Indian country, and NAP and other folks share that, and it's important. And we know that number is largely inflated, in large part because folks aren't capturing how much of that money is going to Native-led organizations because of the inconsistency and how that data is being captured and shared. And so, that's an issue. And so, when I think about how philanthropy, how foundations are capturing and using data, there's a lot of inconsistency from how it's captured, who's capturing it, what information is being captured, and all of this is all data sovereignty issues. Because as the communities who are supposedly being served, whose story is being told here? Who is benefiting from the information that is being shared? And if it really is supposed to be for the benefit of our communities, how are we at the table to talk about that, to talk about what are you capturing? It's a super important question to ask. And quite frankly, across philanthropy, it's not being asked. Foundations often ask for and seek data out about us or on us. And yet that internal piece of their own data collection, how they're capturing that, what questions they're asking, often that's not really discussed. And so that's kind of what I'm here to talk about a little bit. Happy to share more. When I worked at the Bush Foundation, we did a big kind of overhaul of our coding and how we were capturing, how we're doing it in Indian country. Because at the end of the day, we thought it would be, let's pull a report from Salesforce. It didn't work like that. We pulled the report and there were so many inconsistencies, and it took having Native people on staff to be able to go through and raise some of the issues and then have deeper discussions about why are these being tagged as serving Indian country, for folks to understand that there were these data issues. And thankfully the Bush Foundation was up for the challenge and willing to dig into that. But I think it's a thing that a lot of foundations just aren't even aware of, or if they are, they don't quite know how to approach. And so it's a conversation we need to be having, because when we look at that 0.4% of foundation giving is going to Indian country, that includes, grants of folks that are checking the boxes of, we have a Native student and we're a school, or, we're a multi-million-dollar BIPOC initiative, and what does that I actually mean? And so we need to be having more of this conversation, and I'm really excited to be part of this conversation today to get it moving. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for your really active participation in that space to bring those issues forward. I really like the idea of when we talk about data, that people can get lost in the data, who's behind the numbers or just the people that we're trying to account for. So I appreciate you shining the light on that. The next question is actually a two-part question, and I'll start with Kimball first. Kimball and I work on some New Mexico projects, and so I think this is she'll be able to share a lot of insight here. But the first part of the question is, what are some successful examples of building out the infrastructure that is needed to support sovereignty in these spaces and make it successful? And then the second part, and I can reread them as needed. In addition to successful examples, can you share examples of work projects in the pipeline that you believe would make this work forward that is needing funding and additional support? So, Kimball?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, if you would allow me a moment to back up and to kind of explain how the Santa Fe Indian School, K-12 institution became involved in broadband. I think, I'm a practitioner. I am an IT person. So I think, our work really sets us up to my work is leading to the Marina and Carly world. But it is, a prerequisite if you want to have tribally owned and operated networks that are sovereign, because that is our opportunity to really control this space. And telecommunications infrastructure, being new to Indian country in general, it's a greenfield, right? It's an opportunity for us to make those critical decisions on our own and decide what level of management we have, what level of control we have, what level of pricing, and make those designs, as opposed to receiving, like some of our energy companies around us. We don't like the service that we get. We're in trespass, or they're in trespass with their poles. And now we're trying to take back over that infrastructure and then run it to better serve our communities. So in telecommunications, we have this opportunity at a starting point to really decide what sovereignty is going to look like in this space. I came into the field trying to get high-speed, affordable internet in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the capital of New Mexico. And it took me about 6 or 7 years, to be honest. And this was like in the era BTOP days. So that was like the first time that major federal funding was available for broadband. Later on, E-rate, which is FCC Universal Service Fund, Schools and Libraries program for schools and libraries, would allow for fiber construction, as opposed to just getting a discount. A discount's great, but if there's only a smidge of internet available, the biggest discount isn't going to provide the connectivity you need to engage in remote learning or distance learning, at which time in the 2008 was already common, in other parts of the world, most parts of the world, certainly the United States. So back at that time, we were, I mentioned we're an off-reservation boarding school, and we were teaching 5 of our tribal languages on campus. Well, there's certain logistical challenges in that. For instance, if you have a Zuni teacher who calls in sick, you can't just easily find a Zuni substitute teacher in Santa Fe. And so there was a lot of curriculum and that needed to be developed, and then the support systems, for instance, that substitute to really bring our curriculum to where we wanted it to be. And you also can't buy that from Houghton Mifflin. You have to, this is curriculum that has to be designed from community for our own students, and it varies from tribe to tribe. So it occurred to me that we should be using, distant, or like Zoom, these platforms, to connect back to our home communities for the purposes of developing this language curriculum. And at that time, our language programs were largely out of the tribal libraries. So after we got the high-speed internet, after all those years of trying, actually we applied for a BTOP program, and you have to work with your neighbors. You can't do it in isolation. Broadband's too big to do alone. So I was working with Santa Fe Community College, City of Santa Fe County Institute for American Indian Arts. We put in a program. We did great the first round, highest scoring application in New Mexico. Didn't quite make it, went to the second round, and then we hit submit like literally 10 seconds after the grant window closed. But even though that wasn't a success, I learned the community, the provider community that was involved in, wide area networks. And then through those partnerships, we were able to bring the high-speed internet on campus. And then we turned out to our tribal communities were like, yay, we got it. Let's use video conferencing tools and connect back to our language instructors back in community. And they couldn't talk back. The internet was just too slow. At that point, in one of the communities that I would work with, the whole tribal library and tribal government were sharing 2 bonded T1s. So that's 3 megabits of service. That's a third of your cell phone if you have LTE. And so it was just a non-starter. So that's when my leadership says, if we're going to solve for, our curricular issues with our native language programs, just go help them address their internet connectivity. And that's when I told you E-rate changed the rules where you could build networks if you could make a case. So we built 2 consortia, and it's also a line in the ground, like I said, working with your neighbors. So the little tiny community to the north had to work with the one to the south all the way down to Albuquerque to connect to a regional interconnection facility where we could have carrier level internet that we could transport back up to the pueblos and distribute to the schools and libraries. At that time, only half of our tribal libraries even had IT departments as well. So I think the success of the programs had a lot to do with, because it came within community. So it was us, me, and, as an educator who knew the E-rate program and could provide technical assistance. It was our tribal librarians, our education directors, the tribal administrators. There's a need for legal, there's a need for, different domains of knowledge across the process, project managers. And we were able to work together. So there was no time when any of us knew all of the answers, but we would get to something like, okay, we need this, Bureau of Indian Affairs right-of-way environmental assessment question comes up. Who knows something about this? And as a group, we worked together and we built our capacity that way. We learned broadband, but we brought all those individual silos of knowledge that we had been living in those different domains together. And we were able to build out those two networks that were 120 miles. So I think, and when I should say too, E-rate's a very serious program that's just for schools and libraries. Policy reform would recommend now that it extends to home connections, because so much of our education is at night now. It doesn't stop at the computer lab. We're carrying mobile devices around. So we really need that in-home support, which brings up, another host of data sovereignty issues. But as far as, I kind of lost my train of thought, but I guess to go back just to the part A of the question, it's because we worked from within that we were successful. We built these two networks. They served as national pilots and national models that have been built upon. We're building out, I said, in more phases. And because of all that conversation going within our internal working group, and us updating our governors and going to our councils consistently, we changed. It was a whole education shift. So at the beginning, they were like broadband. They understood the importance of the internet, but not that it was essential, and not that it was like, foundationally across our lives. And so in so many ways, not just personally, but, across health, education, environmental protection, all the domains of tribal government. And then at the tribal council level, they was like, sure, you can try to do this. That sounds like a good idea, but there wasn't a lot of deep knowledge. However, that changed radically over the implementation period of the grants. And then we saw tribal council members saying, oh, can we do this with the internet? Can we do this as an economic development stream? And it's kind of nice with fiber optics because we often try to stay in disturbed areas for construction, and it's a non-extractive new vehicle for economic development. So that's very attractive as well. So I'll pause for part 2 of the question.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I was always excited about the work you did during pandemic with the schools and the Native students. And I mean, that's when the gaps became really apparent. So thank you for sharing all that work. And thank goodness some of the work was in progress before pandemic hit. So you were able to address it and in a good way. So the second part of the question is, in addition to the successful examples, can you share examples of work projects in the pipeline that you believe would move this work forward that is needing funding and additional support?
Right. Yeah. And I guess I should say too about that. We are in the internet connectivity, phase, establishing the internet connectivity phase. And then during the pandemic, just to build on what you said, when we surveyed every student at Santa Fe Indian School, we found that only 11% of us had internet that met the FCC's performance benchmark of that at that time, which is 25.3, 25 megabits down. I mean, yeah, down and then 3 up, and now it's 120. So the standard's a lot higher. And it was only the students in town. So when we closed our school and our campus that day in March, we didn't know we were going to be gone for a year and a half. And we sent our students out to 23 of the most rural and remote, least connected places in the United States. So everybody knows that the rural and tribal lands are the least connected. That's a well-established statistic, and that we just had to accept what people had in their homes, because I'm not sure how it was for the rest of you guys, but for us, they physically barricaded our borders, and the back roads, so you couldn't get in or out without permission. People couldn't come in to reduce, contact, but our people couldn't also leave unless they were essential workers in town. And then where our students were going to go to use the internet in the tribal libraries, those closed. We brought in tons of like mobile hotspots, but even gatherings around a bus, that was prohibited in some places. And it was hot in the summer and it was cold in the winter. People that went to McDonald's to use the internet, they couldn't get access to that in town. They couldn't go to Auntie's house. I mean, we were locked with what was in their homes, and cellular, coverage was spotty. And that's when we learned that it was just not negotiable to have residential internet. So it was those communities that I described to you that put in that middle mile background to connect the schools and libraries. At that same time, we knew that we needed to connect beyond just education, that all those other domains that I told you about, they also needed the connectivity for our community benefit. So the tribes invested their private funds, and we put in a second pipe when we had the ground open, and we were able to then use that second during COVID, and for a few $100,000 as opposed to millions of dollars, help those tribes stand up wireless networks. Now with the new federal funding, they're converting over to fiber to the home, but it was in months that we could support our students based on that previous work. And that was one of the tribes, one of our most traditional tribes in New Mexico. If we went out in March, by August, they had connected every home in their traditional village for internet, for education. So we proved that it was doable. It's not such this magical blue orb that floats above us. They're very much sometimes expensive, but tangible construction projects. And to be successful as we move forward, as we see, I mentioned the federal funding, the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program is the biggest first ever federal fund for tribal broadband, with continued support politically. It doesn't have to be once in a generation. It could continue to go, same thing with all the infrastructure funding. But I do middle mile, so I'm putting in another 324 miles. This one's Isleta Akamazuni going out to the Arizona border. But we also worked with those tribes of our consortium to help them with their last mile applications. And some of them want to do it in completely different ways, have different management structures, and that's totally fine. But we provide the technical assistance. My small team does, just as a really goodwill, actually. And so we have those little networks that we're supporting, and there's about 5 or 6 that are coming off of our middle mile. I think in the next year, with this next round of TBCP that closes in January, that every tribe in New Mexico is going to apply. We definitely advocate for the tribally owned and operated network. And if your tribe doesn't have the capacity, and I'm really getting to the answer to the question. If they don't have the capacity, then maybe you need a big brother company to come mentor you until you're up to that level. And that's the skill sets that we're moving. So whereas I told you that half of those tribes didn't even have IT departments 5 years ago, now most do. But managing your WISPs or your ISPs isn't necessarily the same skill set as just being an IT department, because those IT departments are still busy doing IT. It's often a different set of vendors, different equipment types. But then you also need the technical people to roll the trucks, to fix the outage, to help somebody with the accounts, having a billing system. So for our smaller networks, we look at ways where we can collaborate on some of those, or centralize some of those functions, including some of the cybersecurity and gateway services. Those can be very expensive, and those salaries can be very expensive. So how do we work together to help each other? And then there's all the soft skills. Lawyers, we need lawyers that know tribal and broadband. That is something we need. Speaking of data as making your, proving your point, proving your need, defending who you are, GIS specialists. Who knew that GIS specialists were so important in the everyday deployment, especially now with the way that all the federal funding is using the FCC broadband map, which is all, GIS driven. And you're eligible, you're not eligible, depending how many dots you have over your land and what color they are. And you have to make a case using that. When we put in our networks, we created a private cloud environment for those schools and libraries. But now we got to do something cool with it. So how do we use, now that we have a high performance computing capabilities, how do we bring in the programming elements to teach our people to be competent in all these areas that have already been touched on, in addition to creating like career pathways, and know that people can remote work, how are we entering them into new career ways? And then how do we get good with the technology that we can use these large data sets to solve our own community problems? So these are like multi-generational things that are going to, opportunities that are going to play out, but we need to be attacking all of them kind of at the same time, because it's going to take a while to stand up these programs.
Thanks, Kimball, and excellent work in New Mexico and connecting the schools. Really, that was incredible and powerful, and really gave our students an opportunity to re-engage in learning during the pandemic. That was awesome. I'm going to take a question from the audience, Kyle Reese. It's directed at everybody, and it's a similar question that we have coming up. But Kyle, thanks for the question. How can Native-led nonprofits that work with a lot of data best support this work? I will direct that at Carly.
Thank you, Steph. Hi, Kyle. I know you can't, I can't talk with you, but I know who Kyle is. He's at TechSoup. And so his question was around non-native led nonprofits, how they can, that work with lots of data, how they can best support this work. It's doing, part of what you're doing already. And I know from having conversations with you, but it's building those relationships, and having those continuous conversations around, what's the benefit you can provide. We know that, when we think about this on a kind of broader level, we've had some amazing examples of what's happening in Indian country as it relates to data. And we also know that when it comes to philanthropy, folks are often taking these data points that they get from who knows where, and using them to influence their decision making. Those data points should be coming from Indian country, and they should be supporting us to come up with data points that make sense, not just data points that perpetuate the Western narrative, for example. We've talked about this a little bit, I think, but so often data collection, when it comes from a funder kind of perspective, data collection it happens to support the funder strategy, the funder initiative, to support some Western system. And so our tribes, our organizations are using data to meet those needs. And it's so backwards. And so for non-native led nonprofits that work with lots of data, stop doing that. If you want to, with lots of data, best support the work, bring us in early on and say, hey, how can we support you? Instead of saying, hey, we have all this data, what can we do with it? Scratch that. Like, instead, come in and be like, hey, we have these skills, we have this expertise, we have this knowledge. How can we help you? And then help us to come up with like, oh, these are the measures that we would like to see. These are the measures that would be beneficial to our communities. How can you support that? I think that's key, is especially if we're talking about equity, if we're talking about shifting power dynamics of how can you step aside and be willing to support what we need, because the fact of the matter is, for folks talk about how data is supposed to be objective and neutral. It's not. And there are so many power dynamics at play with how data, who is capturing the data and how it's being used. And so if we really want to put this in the hands of Native people, Native entities, and tribes, let's have that conversation of, okay, this is the data that we want to capture. How can you support us to figure out what that model will look like? Because quite frankly, it might take some time. That's the other thing. We are so used to having to do what other people say we should be doing, like being able to have the time to be able to figure out how to capture the data the way that would be beneficial to us. That's going to take some time. And if you got skills and expertise that can help us, let's do it. But we have to be in relationship, and we have to know that we can trust you, and that that data won't, because of the fact that data historically has been used as a weapon against us, to know that it's that we're in a safe space, and that it's going to be used for our benefit. And I think somebody else wants to speak up, so I'll step back.
Yeah, Marina.
So I'm actually really excited to build on what Carly just said, especially since you identified this as tech soup. Over the pandemic, we had really big challenges, especially with technology philanthropy and technology foundations, in actually bringing anything into our communities. And I got into a lot of big fights with philanthropy officers of very large foundations of what we needed from our perspectives and what we needed within our communities, and not bringing that forward. And one of the things that I was constantly hearing was, we need to see who is the most heavily impacted by the pandemic, and most needing of software, hardware, etc., different types of digital related capital that was in the philanthropic space. And it just wasn't coming in, and it didn't come in overall. I was able to secure a grant from the Schusterman Family Foundation for Zoom accounts for all of our Pueblo governors, and they were having challenges in meeting virtually, because that's not a way that we've done our governance in the past, right? And so really, in particular, noticing when there's a lot of community pushback. And I've heard this from very fortunately other Pueblo leaders in tech, who said that other major companies, whether it was Microsoft's foundations or whomever, were not bringing anything into their specific Pueblos either. That when we see collective challenges, we need outside people to help us create a solution, whether it's some arm in TechSoup that specifically focuses on tribal nations. I love TechSoup. I use TechSoup for my NGO, but what is actually coming to our tribal communities in terms of our tribal government, our tribal members, our tribally owned enterprises, our tribal member-owned enterprises, we're not getting those resources, full stop, from any type of tech or software. And that is something that actually, I have one workflow in my NGO right now, and it's called Tech for Sovereignty, and it's specifically trying to address this issue because it is such a big frustration point for me. And the work that I do and what I see possible in terms of making it so that we have we're able to compensate for some of the lack of human resources that we have in whether tribal governance or operations. And I speak from a perspective of my husband being a tribal leader and what's going on in our Pueblo. I know it's not everybody's experience, but a lot of us need to have additional software and services, and need to have training around generative AI and how things like this can really help us enhance what we're able to accomplish in a day. I think those are really, really critical. And then another point that I think is really critical to this conversation and hasn't been brought up is the fact that our data is currency, and that data is being taken from us and utilized as currency in external ways. We need a lot more support in understanding what's possible on the policy side and the governance side and the data governance side of how we can say here's an example of the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, and this is what Europeans enjoy that, Americans don't enjoy, that, tribal members could enact, just copy the same language and like companies already know how to enforce that, right? I think that there's a lot on the data side from data that's collected by and about us that we need support in, just examples of where it's effectively being regulated elsewhere, and support and implementation, especially. So those are my 2 points on that. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And actually, I'm going to direct another really good question from the audience back to Marina. Micah Standing Soldier, the question from Micah is, how do we distinguish data protection and sovereignty between Indigenous folks in Indian country and those living in urban spaces? Should there be a different approach in strategizing action plans?
So my opinion, and again, this is my opinion, it might not align with everybody, but I would say no. I think that there just needs to be a very standard approach for what it means for tribes to be sovereign in cyberspace, and then what those sovereign protections are that are extended to tribal members and tribally owned enterprises, or any tribally owned entity, whatever type of entity it is. These protections can be extended. So, for example, if somebody is, let's say, a European citizen who falls under the General Data Protection Regulation, and they're traveling, they're still protected because of what their home government is saying. So if any company is storing data on them, technically it's illegal, and that gets into some of these liminal spaces under international law, and some emerging spaces under what that enforcement can and should look like. But technically that data can't be stored for any certain length of time. If they have something on the internet, they have something called the right to be forgotten. If they say there's like some speculative story about them that was just uncomfortable, press is weird and people get things wrong all the time. So let's say there was something about a tribal leader that went up, and a tribe had enacted cyber sovereignty, and that tribal leader, say, lived in Santa Fe City proper, right, and not within the boundaries of a reservation. That is something that is equitable enforcement, because digital spaces don't have a physical location. And again, these are emerging spaces. So I think the more that we determine what our rights are, we say what our rights are, and then we work to enforce them, I think the clearer it's going to get, and we're going to be able to set a precedent of what makes sense for us and what protects us in a way that we want to be protected, before somebody from the outside decides what that looks like for Indian country on our behalf, right? Without us being able to say, no, that's not enough, or no, that's not adequate. So I would say, I would love to see, and I'm sure Kimball could speak to this as well, urban Indigenous owned data centers and all sorts of things. But I really think just going through tribal governance and really leaning into what's possible in our sovereignty, and places we haven't explored into it yet, I think that's really the way to go. I don't think you need anything separate. And at that point, once you have that resolution or whatever documentation that you can point to, if you do need to enforce that as somebody living off reservation independently, that should be taken seriously by any corporate legal department, whether it's Facebook or Meta, Alphabet, like any of these companies. I think we need to just start forcing it and testing it, to be honest.
Great. No, thank you for that perspective. I think Kimball had go ahead, Kimball.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to it at an operational level, as IT departments, whether it's a school or a tribal government, we need to have our policies, procedures, and controls relative to, our operations, our account management, our cybersecurity posture. And, that documentation is something that I would say, at least for the school community, isn't something that schools have historically done before. So again, it's this new thing that we're engaging in. Tribal governments, we're seeing a lot of the spear phishing attacks and a lot of, ransomware happening. And, it all goes back to the policies, procedures, and controls when you start to get into what you are following, what happened, if insurance is going to, help with, a payout to help pay the ransom or not. So I think that operationally, like, we need to have trainings for IT people. We need to work our organizations through the development of the policies, procedures, and controls. And then if there's something, that Marina's speaking about, where there's some sort of violation of a right we have, that's what we fall back on with the lawyers. So there's this whole paperwork process that we're starting to engage in, but I think that we're at a very at a stage of infancy in Indian country.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So I want to go back to philanthropy and direct this question to Carly. So Sophie Swartz is in the audience. What else is asking the question? What else, if anything, can philanthropy do to support the development, building of technical data sovereign solutions, models, and communities that goes beyond just funding? So what else besides just funding?
It's a huge question. I appreciate it. This bigger question, I think that we have, and we have so many good examples that are being presented of the nuances in Indian country and the importance of connecting with our communities, because where it stands right now, when philanthropy, if at all, gets data around our communities, I already spoke to that a little bit. Often we're in the other category because we're, statistically insignificant or whatever. But then when you do, dig in a little bit, there's nuances. We have urban, we have native, and I think I saw, there's a question from Auntie Doreen in Chicago about the how native organizations affect urban native data and how the data has been incorrect for the past 30 years. All of this is so important, and all of it speaks to the importance of connection, relationships, conversation, but it's also moving beyond that to actual changed practices. And that's where I think folks they get stuck. We've been in this space of, okay, let's talk about equity and this is important and we're going to acknowledge you. And then it's stop. And so then when it comes to what does that mean? What does that actually look like in practice, especially when it comes to things like data, where again, there's so much that needs to be considered. It's really what you have to do is you got to talk to our people. We have so many experts. I mean, we got folks on this panel who they know their stuff. Connect with us. Build relationships. Let's make it happen, because we know our communities. And that's the other thing is so often I think with a lot of when we're talking about the broader philanthropic space and some of the equity stuff that's happening, it's very BIPOC. Okay. And that I is very broad. Often our people get left out. And so when it comes to these nuances that are so particular to Indian country, they are super important. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've been in, how many tables I've been at where, I've been invited as a Native person to talk about policy change for, nonprofits, for example, but then they want policy change that impacts everyone. And so if it's going to impact everyone, they don't want to hear about our nuances. And that's a problem. And so they need to, we need to keep pushing. Folks need to keep listening or start listening because, if we want to talk about equity, if we want to talk about, moving the needle and, seeing some changes, folks need to be looking to Indian country. And that's just a fact, because the work that we're doing is not just to support our people, it's to save the planet. And we know that it's, we're trying to support our families, we're trying to support the earth. And so, yeah, I just, there are so many issues when it comes to this data piece, and for the philanthropy folks, I think the biggest issue is, it's power, it's trust, it's how do we, we come from a people that have been so overanalyzed, so researched, over researched, not to our benefit. It's been a weapon that's used against us, and so how are we going to turn that around? And part of it is through conversation. And through relationship building, but genuine relationship building where we're actually like taking some action steps and making some changes. And there are some great folks in this room right now who have ideas on how to do that.
Great. And the next question, you already kind of pointed to it a little bit, but by Doreen Weiss, and Carly, if you could take this on as well. How can urban Native organizations affect urban Native data that has been incorrect for the past 30 years?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I don't know the specifics of the question. I think there is so much data out there that is incorrect, in large part because it's been collected. And I don't know if this is the case here. And Auntie Doreen, let me know. But if there's data that's been collected, for the purpose of someone else, the idea being like somebody we're trying to meet, somebody else's their purpose, then we collect information and there's nuances that aren't captured. I mean, this is the thing. It's a thing in philanthropy. It's a thing. It's a thing everywhere. And so again, it's like at a certain point, we have to move forward with, okay, how are we having the conversations internally within our own communities, which folks are here talking about today, of what are we trying to capture? What's the story we're trying to tell? And how do we capture it to the benefit of our people versus philanthropy capturing data? Because when they're trying to capture it, quite frankly, most often it's to the benefit of this. It's to the benefit of philanthropy. It's to the benefit of this broader conversation around like, oh yeah, we're serving Indian country, X, Y, and Z. This is how. And then when we dig in, it's like, well, not really, because if you look at this organization, so, how are we having that conversation on the broader level, but also within our own communities, we do need to be having that conversation of, getting an understanding of what does success look like for us, not just based on what others say it should look like, but what it looks like for us.
Thank you for that. Marina, if you could just kind of speak to what are the challenges and opportunities for Indigenous communities to exercise that data sovereignty? What are those opportunities and challenges there specifically?
So in terms of opportunity, or let's start with challenges. One of the hardest things is understanding how comprehensive like data collection is on us right now, right? Like on us as, individual people, on us collectively as communities, and then just, where and how that data can be disseminated, because the tools that exist right now in this moment have never existed before in history. We don't have a precedent, right? And we don't have a precedent to think about, what the implications of that massive data collection and that massive data scraping can actually look like with frontier technologies and the innovations of tomorrow, right? Like we don't have that sense of urgency about some of these things that we absolutely need to have. One of the groups that I work with the United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, and we talk a lot about emerging threats and, across, various platforms and how, certain groups or demographics or individuals are targeted. And I see some of these things coming in weaponized media narratives and our tribal youth, especially, understanding like how these things are taken from us and what it could do, right? Like that sense of urgency isn't always there. And I think we do need a lot of just expert level support in that space. and it's really difficult, right? Like how many, how we it's not easy to have conversations like this with, tribe in general in tribal communities. Not everybody knows much about it, and I think that's, first basis is, what is it, how can we use it, and then also just the urgency of how can we protect ourselves, and how can this be used against us in harmful ways that we can't even imagine right now, right? Because these things are constantly emerging, and as technology progresses and develops, especially in this, Web 4.0 generative revolution, and one of the great things is that anything built by AI right now cannot be copyrighted. So anything that's scraped from us, that's turned into something else without consultation or consent, has no ability to be taken as unique IP by anyone else. That's a big positive. But were tribes part of those conversations, and were we thinking or talking about what that could do to us? We weren't. And we have to be. We absolutely have to be, for the future and of our tribal communities and the continuation of our cultures. And then in terms of opportunities, wow, it is again incredibly broad, right? And when we look at who are global powerhouses in the world, and how these digital spaces are becoming, larger and larger percentages of large economies, global GDPs, right? Like China's GDP in tech right now is almost 40%. That's crazy. It's almost half of all the money that's coming in to their economy has to do with tech, right? And then we see various countries just trying to pivot from even extractive industries. Something like Saudi Arabia is moving into putting all of their money into innovation, and how they can take whatever is emerging in terms of frontier technologies, as well as innovation they can acquire. For us, the way our data, and especially traditional ecological knowledge, things that are community and location specific, that is absolutely invaluable. And being able to steward that in a digital space, or an electronic space, or in a written space, has to be done under cultural protocols that we are determining align with our value systems. And for us to determine that and say, look, we can use whatever this teaching is vaguely, broadly, in this type of company that a tribal member starts, and it has to be under this type of governance in the general market. And that piece of intellectual property is not something that can be sold as something unique to whatever goes out into the market, right? And these things are being taken from our communities, whether we like it or not. And so getting ahead of what that looks like also creates really tremendous economic opportunities and ways to participate in, if we're participating in this digital economy in a meaningful way, we don't always know when a traditional thing is going to happen or a cultural thing is going to happen. But if you're not home when someone comes and knocks on your door and they need you, if you had to commute an hour and a half into a city, especially for a job that's underpaid, you're stuck, and you're not able to help out, or you're not able to continue whatever that thing is that needs to continue. And I think it's particularly important that we understand that the data is a huge form of currency, and this is very, very, very valuable. What is being taken from us, just as just people living in this economy where we're on our laptops and our phones, and just average, again, under American rights, that data is being sold and generated and taken into other things. We can take that back. We could say that it's for sale. We can say all sorts of different things about that, but it creates economic potential that doesn't exist. Tech jobs are generally a third above market than non-tech enabled jobs. And, again, if you don't have to commute that hour and a half away from your tribal community, and some people are fortunate to be, or unfortunate to be located closer to cities. But, that is more time in your day, right? And when we think of everything an Indigenous person has to steward and carry, right? Language and culture and, traditional things that are hugely time intensive. Like I always try to explain to people that, especially anyone who has any type of traditional responsibilities in their home communities, are really working like 2 and 3 full-time jobs at once, right? And so making sure that things that are above market compensation, that are at either on our own time or work from home or having this capacity, that frees up so much more time, and that really allows culture to continue, that allows better economic outcomes, which poverty erodes our bodies on a cellular level. Like there's worry and stress and things when we don't have what we need or don't have the ability to have legal protections or health specializations that we need to bring home. So I really think this is the biggest transformative potential we have access to, is using this data, using these digital economies in thoughtful and effective ways for us, and then also pushing back against digital forms of colonization. It was mentioned about, Kimball had mentioned about televisions coming into our communities and changing the way that we see ourselves and we interact. That is so much more rapid with the media that we consume in like small micro bites on digital platforms. And what's great is there's just massive amounts of native creators who are creating content that they would like to see and that resonates with the communities. But at the end of the day, it's still massively external in the way that even the platform that we're streaming on right now is structured by someone who is not thinking in a way that a native person thinks. And we might when we meaningfully participate in the innovation economy, we might have better outcomes in the products that we're creating because we're able to think more holistically and connected. So huge challenges on both ends. Thank you. That was a lot.
Yeah, I'm going to move into our last question. Time has passed so quickly. But the final question, and I'll start with Kimball, is how can philanthropy move to support these opportunities while removing barriers that currently prevent progress? And so, in our experience in working in New Mexico, one of the biggest challenges that we've seen is a lot of this great funding coming in requires a match. And how can we count on philanthropy to support that and really take every barrier off the table for New Mexico tribes to have access to these once-in-a-lifetime funding opportunities? But I will pass it to you, Kimball, to offer more in that to that question.
Yeah, so with the funding, it's tribes are eligible for this $42.5 billion. I know New Mexico, we received $675 million that'll be put out for applications next year. Tribes are eligible, local governments are eligible, nonprofits are eligible. But are we viable? Not really. This program was designed to support industry. And so there's the match. There's other barriers to the application process. Lines of credit, clean audited financials. Sometimes you need a professional engineering stamp. So the technical, those things are going to prevent a lot of the non-ISPs, new entrants, from entering into this space. But the market didn't build out networks and provide us high-speed, affordable choices because the population is sparse. It's really expensive to build. The two most expensive places to build, I think, are New Mexico and Alaska. So the market didn't serve us. So waiting for the market to serve us is a bit of a folly to me. So that's why I think that uplifting these tribal efforts to build our own networks is our key, is our solution to the digital divide. Some of the challenges, though, to do that are with that particular fund, the federal funding, the lack of grant writers out there. Even if we can look for our local philanthropy to provide some funds, and they did, and that was great. But there's just not enough grant writers out there. I go back to that GIS specialist. You can't, we need those. I go back to the lawyers. We need tribal broadband lawyers. So it's just the professional engineering, when that comes up. And then these grants are so top heavy, like on ours. The compliance, the post-grant compliance is enormous. And you need somebody that's going to be staffed in that position. So whether it's just funding to support all those soft skills around, the actual infrastructure build, then it's developing, getting our utility departments together and teaching them how to apply for these big top heavy federal grants so that they can be on time, on budget for whatever they're doing, but they can also stay out of legal problems. And that's just something that those are the capacities that we really need to develop internally. So it turns out sometimes you also need a lobbyist. You need this advocacy to both at the state, at the federal level, because broadband is evolving so quickly, or with the funding at least, nationally, there's still an opportunity to write the rules. There's the tribal spectrum issue. That's another huge sovereignty issue, right? We haven't, unlike, our other natural resources, we don't control the airwaves above us. So the FCC has sliced and diced it and leased it out, and we don't even have access to use it. So for the first time ever in 2020, the FCC was going to do a public auction for a pretty lucrative band called the 2.5 gigahertz. It's used a lot by the phones, the mobile carriers, and the tribes, if there was unleased spectrum, and there wasn't a lot over where tribes live near urban areas, but if there was, then we could lease it for free. So it was this first time that we could take control of the airwaves to deploy networks. But that kind of opportunity might not happen again. So we need to teach ourselves how to advocate for these tribal issues in the FCC forums or in Congress to really, I think, also position ourselves for success. But on the I think where philanthropy can also do a lot is with our youth. There's STEAM programs, there's a lot of nonprofits, they're often not that expensive to engage, but it's having the coordinators. Like I know at the Indian school, there's a lot of nonprofits we work with, but having that internal capacity to coordinate them and organize the activities and then start to develop really scaffolded experiences that start in upper elementary or even lower elementary, and that continue to grow, so that when it's a little bit too late at senior year to take one CS class and really be set up for success in college. So we really need to think thoughtfully as an education community about how we're preparing our students and getting the internships, getting them into any of these experiences. So some of them are going to be STEAM, some of them are going to be multimedia, some of them might be business, we all need our managers, some of them, might be lawyering. So I think once we start looking at broadband and see how it permeates everything, like I said, it's foundational in telehealth and education, then I think that we need to start kind of uplifting that topic in these areas. So that we can use the technology in the ways that are going to be most beneficial to the individuals and the communities. So thank you.
Thanks, Kimball. Marina, any closing words for our philanthropic friends on how we can do things different?
Gosh, Kimball did a really good job just now explaining all of those pieces. Just adding on to that is, a lot of what I see come into our tribal communities, particularly our pueblos here in New Mexico, is when we have access to digital opportunities, they are not market competitive. They are not market relevant. There's one of my relatives in Zia right now, like her younger brother's studying for a certificate in for digital workforce. And to me, it's a digital janitor role, and it's very, very low paid. And we're not just there to be the lower skilled workforce, right? And we shouldn't be forced into those spaces. We need market competitive opportunities. We need, things that are going to help us move forward and get ahead, that are, highly skilled, that, are, top of market software and trainings and things like that. We don't just need what the lowest potential thing that can come to us is, and that's unfortunately a lot of what's there now, and what keeps coming forward. And I just don't want to see our kids being pulled into those things anymore.
Thanks, Marina. Carly, any last words?
Thank you, Steph. I just want to extend appreciation to everyone here. Also, just want to put a shout out, Steph, top 50, over 50 for Forbes. Huge. If you don't know what I'm talking about, looking up. That's a big deal in Indian country. So I have to say something. So I think one is acknowledging the issue, because I don't think that's happening enough, is that this data stuff, that it's a big deal, and that it's multifaceted. So we're talking about both the data, the data that foundations are using to make decisions, the data that they're capturing and sharing. We're talking about the data that our communities are using and capturing and sharing. And all of this is connected. It all tells part of this broader story. And so part of it is, this is an equity issue. Folks may not realize that, or may not think about it that way, but it very much is. There are power dynamics that are at play. There are expectations at play. There are, time constraints, because we're busy trying to fill these, voids, or fill out these grant applications and reports, so we don't have time to get to what we want to get to. All of that is super important. So engage with us, build those relationships, and be open for the, philanthropic audiences. Be open to unfamiliar data practices. The stories as Indigenous people that we have to share through our data, through like what we would like to be able to share, what if we had the time and energy to be able to build, and some of it which is out there, and it could be even better. It's rich. It's incredibly rich, and it has the power to influence on a greater level. When you think about this universal design idea of, when you build something to benefit those who are kind of most disenfranchised, everybody benefits. This is a great example of that. We are the folks who are the most statistically insignificant. We're in the other category. We're the original people of this land. If we actually look at data from our perspective, everybody benefits, and it's actually a win-win situation, but folks don't realize that. They don't see that. So the number one thing is acknowledging the issue, and then taking action. Engage with the folks. We have tons of folks, and some of whom are on this call today, who have a really good understanding about some of the data issues and what needs to happen. And so let's do it. Let's stop talking about equity and take some action toward some collective change.
Wow. We were in for a treat today. Amazing, insightful. Our audience was engaged. They had a number of questions. I didn't get to all of them. So thank you to our audience. Thank you to our panelists. Keep an eye on these amazing humans on this panel today. They are doing big things in Indian country. So excited for what's in store. Had a wonderful session today. I'll pass it over to Anoka for closing.
Thank you, Steph. And thank you all for joining us today and being part of this enlightening discussion on Indigenous data sovereignty and beyond. Many thanks to our moderator, Steph, and our panelists, Carly, Marina, and Kimball, for bringing their unique perspectives and expertise to the table. As we wrap up, let's not forget the significance of what we've discussed. Indigenous data sovereignty is not just a matter of data ownership, but cultural preservation and knowledge protection. It is vital that we recognize and respect Indigenous rights, especially in the digital age that we live in. To continue this important dialogue, I encourage all our viewers to delve deeper into the topic of Indigenous data sovereignty, educate yourself, engage with Indigenous voices, engage with these folks here, and support organizations that champion these rights. Before we close, a little housekeeping. You should be receiving an email shortly with a link to a brief survey. Please take time to share your thoughts. It only takes about 4 minutes, and it really does help us to improve these types of events. As a reminder, this session is open to the public as a highlight of our member benefits. NAT membership is open to our Indigenous relatives and non-Indigenous allies. If you're not a NAT member and want to learn more, please visit nativephilanthropy.org. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you on September 28th for member education sessions, Indigenous food sovereignty. Take care.